welcome back to another episode of Sustainapod, a youth-led podcast for young people and anyone passionate about issues related to sustainability. I'm Belinda, and this episode is co-hosted alongside my fellow co-founder, Arwen. And today we'll be talking about a topic that's very close to my heart, which is the power of social entrepreneurship to address complex sustainability and development challenges facing our world today. I'm very excited to announce our guest, Jordan Wolken. Jordan is the global president of Bridges for Enterprise, which is a student-led nonprofit working to support social entrepreneurs in developing countries. He's someone I've had the pleasure of working with a few years ago in BFE, and very much someone that I look up to a lot in this space. So Jordan, it's really great to speak with you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Belinda.
Great, so I'll let Arwen start us off with the first question.
Yeah, okay. So the first question is just to briefly introduce yourself and kind of ease into it. And so maybe could you explain the story of how you became interested in social entrepreneurship personally?
Yeah, for sure. I'm Jordan. I'm 24 years old. I grew up in Chicago, or a nearby town, and I went to university at NYU. So I studied business and political economy there. Really was interested in going to a bigger city and meeting new people from different parts of the world, and NYU allowed me to do so. And the program I studied in encompassed 2 required study abroad semesters. So I was lucky enough to spend almost half of my college experience overseas. So I was studying in London, Shanghai, Paris, and also did short-term study abroad experiences in Ghana, Abu Dhabi, and other places. And it was very, very eye-opening for me. As someone who didn't travel internationally growing up, I was super excited to see parts of the world and understand how business and politics interplayed across different environments. And I became very fascinated by entrepreneurship early on. When I took a trip to Ghana my first year at NYU, there was an elective course called Social Entrepreneurship in Ghana. We got to travel to Accra and then a local community in the Volta region, which is right on the border with Ghana and Togo. And we were working with a female-owned social enterprise for a week to help incubate some business ideas in their community. And that project became what's now called Amenuveve, which is a nonprofit that is continuing to thrive in the community. And it was some very impactful work that we were doing and quite eye-opening for me, and something that inspired me to continue to become interested in social entrepreneurship and to pursue it as a viable career opportunity. So after returning from Ghana freshman year, I became involved with Bridges for Enterprise. And that's something that I've continued to be involved with to this day. So I would say that's the first period of inspiration for me, and something that I think about a lot still.
I think it's really amazing that you've had such global exposure studying in the US and having these experiences in different African countries, and then also in Paris as well. So could you compare what social entrepreneurship is like in the developing context, say on the continent of Africa, versus in Europe, where you've had an experience to also study?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in Europe, it's more well understood. So the concept of social entrepreneurship emanated from the US originally in the 60s, 70s, with faith-based investing, investors who wanted to kind of put their money into places that could generate both financial and impact returns, quote unquote. And that's evolved quite a lot. And in 2010, the whole field of impact investing and social entrepreneurship were mostly launched by the Rockefeller Foundation and other organizations in the US. And since then, I mean, it's really exploded as a concept, but again, mostly across the developed world, you could say. But in places like Africa and other emerging markets, the majority of, those are the regions where the majority of investments are still to this day impact-based capital, and it's going towards social enterprises. And I think that still entrepreneurs in Europe or the US have like a maybe better understanding of what social entrepreneurship is all about, and how they could create a business that is at its core embedding impact into its model. But social entrepreneurs exist around the world. It's not defined to one region. And what I've seen is that entrepreneurs across the world are just really passionate about solving issues that are embedded into their communities, and they're using social enterprise as a tool to help create change. And it's quite remarkable to see the rise of social entrepreneurship around the world. In Europe, it seems that funding is more separate. So you have like impact investing as kind of a separate type of finance versus more traditional venture capital or private equity investment. And then in emerging markets, it seems to blend a lot more. So you see impact investors on the same cap table as venture capital firms, as well as philanthropic funders. They all kind of overlap to support the same business. And in Europe and the US, it's more separate. So that's also a note I've seen. But yeah, the field continues to evolve. And I think it'll be interesting to see where things lie in the next 5 to 10 years, for instance.
So, following your experiences of entrepreneurship in both underdeveloped and developed countries, what would you say the differences are in terms of the topics of interest? So, for example, would developed countries be more interested in funding mitigation technologies and underdeveloped countries to be interested in adaptation?
Yeah, well, from a climate perspective, I would say that when it comes to funding environmental startups, most of the funding that's going into Europe and the US seems to be on mitigation as opposed to adaptation. Um, but in general, globally, it's more focused on mitigation as well as opposed to adaptation. And there's some interesting statistics that have come out, I think, recently by Climate Tech VC, which is a great resource for anyone interested in this space. And adaptation funding has been increasing, I would say, in the emerging market context, in particular around this topic of climate resilience. So there's more investors, particularly impact-focused investors, that are looking at startups that are trying to adapt to the changing environment. And adaptation is becoming more prevalent as an issue and a topic across emerging markets in particular. So there's an example like Catalyst Fund, which is a well-known accelerator and investor, particularly focused on emerging markets and Africa in particular. And they've been very vocal in supporting climate resilient startups that are specifically building, businesses that are addressing adaptation solutions to climate. So that could be like an example of an insure tech product, so insurance technology product that's helping to build insurance for local communities or local farmers that are trying to make sure that their crops have protection when there's weather shocks, for instance. And there's plenty of other examples out there of what a climate resilient startup could look like, and it's becoming more popular as a funding avenue for impact investors in emerging markets.
I think that's really interesting, and just kind of wanted to add that, especially in this landscape, because my thesis is actually looking at developing insurance for coastal fishing communities in Melanesia. There's a growing landscape of partnerships and different alignments, for example, different policies. And so in a way, I think social entrepreneurship has really been seen as very key to achieve things like the Paris Agreement and sustainable development, so the SDGs as well. So on this note, what do you think are kind of the key barriers still facing the ability for social entrepreneurship to really almost unleash its full potential to contribute to these different global goals?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think my answer will be more focused towards emerging markets. So I'd say maybe three things are the biggest barriers I see to growing the movement for social entrepreneurship. So one is the regulatory environment needs to improve a lot. And in many countries, social entrepreneurship is still not really well understood by lawmakers. And there aren't really favorable policies in place to support social entrepreneurs to raise funding, as well as to continue to form partnerships and grow their business. And I think that more needs to be done from a tax perspective, as well as just a general policy perspective. So there are regulations out there to support entrepreneurs and investors, like startup acts, for instance, which are becoming more prevalent across Africa. And it's really exciting to see, but then they're not really geared towards social entrepreneurs in particular. So I think that more can be done there should be tax incentives in place, for instance. And also sometimes the governments are not super excited about innovation happening. And I think that sometimes they try and stifle innovation as opposed to enabling it. And I think that more can be done in terms of working with lawmakers and other public sector agencies to support social entrepreneurs to make it easier for them to grow. So that's the first barrier I see. The second barrier I'd say is pretty well known, which is capital. So there's just still a very big gap in terms of financing for social enterprises in emerging markets versus developed markets. And I think that more innovative ways of financing can be developed in the next 5 to 10 years to grow the share of funding being doled out for these social enterprises. So there's new forms of impact investing or blended finance, you could say, that are going towards social enterprises in these markets that are only now just becoming more popular and prevalent. And I think these types, such as impact linked finance, and there's a bunch of other tools out there that can be very exciting for entrepreneurs to take on and more actually palatable for them in terms of the terms that they're given when it comes to investment. So I look forward to seeing the share of capital growing. I also am excited about the democratization of capital in these markets. So it's becoming more easy for retail investors like you and I to invest money into startups, which is a very risky asset class. But as long as you are aware of the risks and you do your due diligence on what you're investing in, you can actually support businesses in these contexts more easily than you ever could before. And I think that's a very promising way for more capital to be directed to these businesses. So I think those are some key trends, and I hope that it will unlock some of those barriers. And then the third thing I'll touch on is really about networks and community. I see that as a barrier for social entrepreneurs to gain access to grow their business in emerging markets in particular. And that's something that Bridges for Enterprise tries to address by having a global platform to support social entrepreneurs who may not otherwise have access to a network and a community that can help grow their business. And usually social entrepreneurs are quite siloed in their markets, focusing on selling products and services to support, local communities. And it oftentimes, it isn't so easy for them to get in touch with other entrepreneurs in different regions around the world who are focusing on a similar problem and may have, interesting learnings or insights to share with them that can help their business. And I think the connections and the networks are really critical, not just from a business growth perspective, but also from a funding perspective, because most oftentimes the people that are still investing and giving out grants in these markets come from the West, and they're not coming from emerging markets. So if you can cultivate those networks and those connections before heading to, a potential investment opportunity, even better, because that way, you'll have a stronger footing by which you can negotiate, and you'll have more easy access to raising finance. So I think trying to balance some of the networks and connections out there is really critical to grow social entrepreneurship across emerging markets. And I hope that more platforms out there exist 5 to 10 years from now to be able to do that.
Great, lovely to hear. I really wanted to go back on your point on sustainable investment and making it more accessible for retail investors like, individuals like us to invest and actually kind of be more involved with the economy more directly, I would say. So I see a lot of behavior amongst even my friends, or people who are privileged enough to afford to invest at our age. But you can see a lot of behavior starting to change, and you see even on Instagram, for example, social media, there are a lot more educational platforms that allow individuals to learn how to be more sustainable and be more mindful in what you invest in. And so, I think there's a new generation coming to kind of steer us towards that direction of sustainable investing. To move on now, you did mention about Bridges for Enterprise. So would you kind of want to introduce what Bridge for Enterprises does and what your role was or currently is in?
Yeah, definitely. I think Belinda could also talk about Bridges for Enterprise too, but I'll give a brief intro and share some things. And Belinda, yeah, if you want to add anything about your experience with the organization, please do. Yeah, Bridges for Enterprise is a nonprofit based in the UK that was founded in 2015 at the University of Cambridge. And since its founding has kind of expanded globally, we exist to serve social entrepreneurs in emerging markets and make it more easy for them to access tailor-made consulting services to grow their business. So that's at its core what Bridges for Enterprise does. And we do that through a free 6 to 8 month incubation program that we offer to early stage social enterprises. And most of the time they come from Africa, but we also serve entrepreneurs in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Middle East. And they serve communities in a variety of sectors. So education, healthcare, clean energy, food and agriculture, stuff like that. And we serve them in this incubation program in multiple ways. There's kind of 4 components to the program. So we have a guaranteed consulting element to it, a guaranteed financial advisory element to it, and then there's optional legal advisory and technical advisory elements to the program. Each element, if you will, lasts for 3 to 4 months, which is the timeline of a semester. And it's designed to support the business in which way they need support. So our job, because it's a free program run by volunteers, is to just kind of empower them and make sure that, you know, we're servicing them wherever they identify the needs. So we're not here to just impose particular solutions that we think would work for their local context, because we're not in their environment servicing those customers day in and day out. And we're just there to help their business and be a support resource for them to grow. So that's at its core what BFE offers in its incubation program. We've since inception served over 100 social enterprises around the world across 30 plus countries. And we have now something like over 300 global volunteers working with us across the world. So we have 5 chapters that are mostly doing the actual incubation program work. So we started at Cambridge, and then we expanded in 2017 to Singapore, and then soon after to New York. And then recently we've expanded to Vancouver, Canada, and New Delhi, India. And these chapters based in these, you know, cities around the world are made up of anywhere between 20 to 50 students from top universities studying a variety of things. And there's different teams within each chapter that are responsible for conducting the incubation program work. And then those chapters are supported by professional mentors who are professionals based in those cities or nearby that are offering pro bono support to the students as well as the entrepreneurs to make sure that things run smoothly and they have the right expertise to actually deliver the work. So it's a multi-franchise model, if you will. And at the global level, we're there just to support the chapters and make sure everything runs smoothly. So my role as global president is to support all of the chapters and the entire global team that's responsible for running the organization on the day-to-day. The caveat is that we have, you know, all volunteers. So, you know, I'm only spending 5 to 10 hours a week, let's say, on Bridges for Enterprise. And it used to be maybe a bit more time, but recently, because I went to graduate school, I had to scale back slightly. But as we grow forward, I think we're trying to expand to more chapters and trying to serve more social enterprises while still maintaining a level of quality in our work. And it will require more hands-on support from me in the future. So I'm looking forward to that as we grow and move forward. But hopefully that gives you a snapshot of what we do.
Yeah, I wanted to add that being part of Bridges for Enterprise has honestly been like an amazing experience for me. And I feel like one of the best and most challenging things simultaneously is this multi-party, multi-stakeholder kind of model that you've laid out, Jordan, because from the perspective of the students that are in the chapters and then the entrepreneurs that they're working with and then the mentors, there's impact for everyone in in so many different ways. It's just as rewarding for the students to get to really speak to these entrepreneurs, and vice versa for these entrepreneurs to meet these students from other parts of the world. And that's amazing. But again, it's also super challenging to make sure that that engagement stays. There's many different scenarios that might affect that. So I think that is definitely really challenging. And you mentioned this decentralization kind of part, which is also something that will affect, for example, things like cohesion between, coordinating projects across the world. So what are the kind of key strategies that you think have really helped to bring the organization together and align the different many moving parts?
Yeah, such a good question. I think that one of the big strategies is making sure we have the right set of responsibilities for people in the organization, and we make sure that they stay motivated to do the work. It sounds basic, but at the end of the day, we are a volunteer-based organization. So anyone contributing time to us is more than welcome, and we want to make sure that their time is super valuable, and making sure that they are feeling like what they're doing is actually making a difference, because they could easily spend their time elsewhere, and they're just choosing to spend part of their weekend or weekday evenings with BFE, and we're very grateful for that. So on our end, we try and make sure that the roles are well shaped to their interests, and that it serves whatever goal they're trying to accomplish, either professionally or personally. Obviously in line with what BFE's goals and strategies are, but still we want to make sure that it's well shaped to their interests. So that's a big part of it. And then I would say otherwise, just trying to keep a cohesive global community is very difficult, as I'm sure you realized when you were part of BFE. It oftentimes is the case where people become siloed in their own division or their own workflow, and they have limited interactions with other folks in the organization. I think what we're trying to establish is a global Slack community, or a global just community in general, where people feel comfortable interacting with one another, even if they're not working with them directly. And that's, a huge challenge, something we've tried to cultivate more and more as we grow, but it's inevitably very difficult because we have so many time zones now, people working at different hours and, in different parts, whether they're in the chapters or at the global level. So we continually try and strive for this, but it's definitely a challenge. So those are some things I would highlight off the top of my head, but there's definitely more strategies we've taken to try and grow the organization. It hasn't been easy, but I think we're trying to do it in a way that's organic and sustainable, because at a certain point, it becomes very hard for us at the global level to try and maintain visibility over what's happening at the chapter level. And we have a limited number of people at the global level. And if one person suddenly leaves, for instance, it becomes hard to kind of replace them and make sure we have enough people in the pipeline to be able to fulfill those responsibilities. So we are trying to do it in a way that's balanced and organic, managing the amount of resources we have at our disposal.
Do you have any advice or any tips in terms of getting startups investor ready, or any key trends or changes lately in terms of what investors are looking for in a startup?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I think my answer would vary. It really depends on the type of business and the type of investor that the business is seeking. I would say generally I can talk about some high level trends that might be relevant for all businesses that come into Bridges for Enterprise. So we service a very particular type of startup. It's an early stage social enterprise. By early stage, we mean post revenue. They usually have existed for 3 to 4 years at that point, and they have already started to generate some traction locally. Maybe they're not ready to expand yet, but they're looking towards servicing new customers and growing their business even further. And they probably have not raised any institutional funding yet. So no funding outside of friends and family or a bank loan or a small grant. And we're trying to get them to that next phase, which is maybe taking on investment or some type of support grant, something like that, which comes from a more high level institution and might be in a higher amount. So I would say one big trend we've seen is the increasing need to measure impact. And, this is coming from not just impact investors, but also from grant funders. They increasingly want to see a commitment to quantifying and measuring impact on the ground. So, not just looking at financial returns, but also looking at, what it means for an education technology startup in Kenya to measure the impact, the learning outcomes of their product, and doing it in a way that shows that there's a measurable difference that the business is making relative to what otherwise would have occurred for those students had the product not existed in that market. So, how can you do that at an early stage where the business is kind of strapped for resources and they have, limited time and capabilities to do that? Because impact measurement work is very complex and time consuming. And that's sometimes a real challenge. So for investors, I think they want more rigorous impact measurement work to be done in order to evaluate their investments, but they don't sometimes realize that, entrepreneurs have limited time and they don't necessarily have to spend it all on measuring impact because they have to maintain their sustainability as an organization, right? So BFE can come in, and other organizations like BFE can support entrepreneurs on that impact measurement journey and make it easier for them to start to measure their impact in a way that investors would want them to. So that's, some high level trend that I see being relevant for all of the entrepreneurs that come into our program, because they embed impact into their core mission. It's not just trying to generate profit, but also trying to mesh that with purpose and making a difference in their community, whichever which way they see fit.
That's a really interesting trend and very exciting to see where it goes. So thanks a lot for that insight. For the final segment, we're going to move to talk a little bit more about kind of career decisions, which is something really relevant for a lot of our listeners. You've been really open-minded about, getting exposure in different fields and really, being open-minded in that sense. So how did you create that path from knowing what you're passionate about in the social impact space and then linking it directly to opportunities that will get you there, and also, for, in relation to the fact that you're starting a job soon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will be starting a job on August 1st. I'll be moving to Berlin, which is a new adventure for me. I'll be working in the impact investing, impact measurement world in emerging markets in particular. And I'm quite excited about that. It's very relevant to what I've been doing with Bridges for Enterprise, but also recently with Sherpa Ventures, which is a pre-seed African VC firm, and other organizations. And I guess career-wise, it's been a long journey for me since going to Ghana and realizing I had an interest in social entrepreneurship. I think that I started out wanting to go into the economic development, like foreign aid world, if you will. And then I quickly realized that that didn't really have as big of an impact on the ground as I wanted it to have. And I became skeptical of foreign aid in general. And I wanted to focus my efforts more so on private sector innovation, because I thought that that would be a more viable avenue for development locally and for people to gain access to products and services that can better their lives. And I quickly turned to entrepreneurship, right? And I think that that was a long journey. It didn't happen immediately. It was like 2-3 years after realizing this interest, and then doing research and doing internships in various spaces, and then coming to that realization. It's been something that's been an exciting journey, also very global as a journey. I would definitely recommend that any student, if they have the opportunity and the privilege to travel, to go for it. It really opens your eyes and makes you a more worldly citizen and helps you put your experiences into better perspectives. And I think it, can only help you at such a young age realize what you want to do. So for me, it's been very beneficial, and I would definitely highlight that as a core part of why I'm going where I'm going.
I'm pretty sure a lot of our listeners would really want to take up on your advice. But do you have any ending advice for these young people interested in the social entrepreneurship space?
Yeah, I would say
just a quick tip. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say to, stay open to the field, right? Don't just be as open as possible, right? Try and read as much as you can, talk to people in the space, have an open mind when you're going into it, because the field is still evolving. And I think there's still a lot of opportunities there and yet to be had. So, just continue to pursue the field, but do it in an open-minded way where you don't become so narrowly focused at an early stage, because as was indicative in my journey, like I still had an open mind. I still do, right? And I don't know what my interest will be 5 years from now, but I know that by staying open, I'm at least exploring other opportunities and seeing like what's out there within the social entrepreneurship and impact investing world, because the field is still growing. So yeah, I would say explore, talk to people, and continue to keep an open mind. And remember that, you can make a difference in which way you want to. You don't have to go into social entrepreneurship to be like a difference maker at all. So it's just one viable industry that could be relevant for certain types of people, but maybe not everyone. But that would be my advice.
That's brilliant advice. And I also just wanted to wrap up in terms of reflecting on BFE and also my experiences, that a lot of this conversation has been focused on impact, and actually sometimes that can result in being a bit result oriented in terms of deliverables. But I think actually the real impact also comes from the journey, be it, Jordan, your career experience starting from Ghana, or it's the journey of growing BFE. I think there's a lot of impact created there as well. So we definitely can't discredit that and just look at the outcomes, and everything is all really impactful and important in that sense as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that.
Thank you, Jordan, for sharing all your insights, and thank you to Sustainapod listeners for tuning in this week with us. We would love to hear from you about this episode, so let us know your questions and comments by messaging us on Instagram at sustainapod_GIH or email us at sustainapod@gmail.com. See you next time.